This morning, I want to talk a little bit, pardon me, about connectedness. Now, I actually looked that word up on dictionary.com, and it actually is a word that doesn't exist except only in mathematics. So those of you who are mathematicians know. So it's kind of a great sort of new agey psychotherapy sort of wonderful lingo, and it works. I'm going to use it. It's wonderful. But I want to say, in the experience of my father's death earlier this summer, when he died and my mother died, I was strangely sort of flatlined about resurrection and concern, but things sort of arise as emotional process, and we move on, life moves on. And right now it is about connection and connectedness, being connected with this life and missing that connection, and wanting to be connected, and things moving so fast, right? So anyway, connectedness that needs to become more apparent in this particular week anyway. So today's meditation is actually about that, and just a bit of a meditation from my work as St. Mark's preschool chaplain. And maybe consider part of this a mid-year departmental report. How about that? So last Wednesday, we had preschool chapels, as we do most Wednesdays, and this is the first summer, by the way. I understand, I checked with Deacon Susie, that chapel has continued through the summer. So to be able to say we had preschool chapel as we do most Wednesdays is a lovely reference to the developing ministry of this church community. A lovely thing. So usually I stay a few hours after the morning's chapels, and just to remind you, each class has their chapel. So with the construction of this new room that's going on, beginning in October, we should have 3 chapels on Wednesday morning, and then in January, when the 3-year-olds are old enough to sort of get their bodies in a line, sort of, then we'll have 4. Wonderful. Love it. So anyway, I stayed a few hours after Wednesday's chapels, and I ran into a boy and his father as they were leaving. And I remembered that in chapel, the boy had a question that we did not get to. I asked him what his question was. He said he forgot, but Daddy had another one that he remembered. Well, what is it? I asked. He said, "Is Jesus made up?" And my first thought was, I was sorry that I remembered to ask him, and that he remembered this other question. Because in chapel, everything I do, and it's actually one of my charges, one of in my sort of job description for the content, and that's me as well. Everything I do is about the reality and providence of God and the steadfast love of God. And I wondered, how did this question come to this 4- and 2-month-year-old? How did that come to him? So being careful not to reveal that I was putting off the inevitable conversation about this, I said, I don't think so. I don't think Jesus is made up. But let's talk about it in chapel next week. So 2 days later, on Friday, I was at church preparing for this morning. And I thought I would share my exchange with this boy, with our preschool director, Julia Peacock. So I went to her office and sat down and told her about it. And if you haven't been to Julia's office this summer, it's moved from where it was over there to the library there, and it's an actual throughway. So people walk through to be able to get around the construction and to get where they're going. So I was sat down and told her about it, and she said, he's a boy that always asks questions. I so like that he does. His family is great at encouraging questions in him. Then she said, I remember there's a follow-up that this very morning to your conversation that you had on Wednesday I want to tell you about. She said, so Friday morning, this morning, his class moved into the church space here for activities because it was so much cooler in the heat. And he arrived Friday after activities had begun and was told that his class was in the church. And before he understood why, Julia said he literally went into an emotional, maybe spiritual meltdown because he mistakenly thought that chapel was happening and he was missing chapel and that it started before he arrived, missing it. And it took him a bit for him to eventually cool down and understand what the situation really was and then to regain his composure to join his class. And it's not about me, this is about him. I am anxious to see, why the meltdown, why chapel was so important on Friday, and if indeed it was about the question that he remembered to ask. So of all coincidences, as Julia was telling me about the morning spiritual meltdown, a mother and her 4-year-old daughter walked through Julia's office. Now, this little boy's family, by the way, I'm not sure what the ritual, spiritual context is of his family, but the little girl and her mother that came through, actually, she's a Lutheran pastor. And so the mother, of all coincidences, said she recently asked her, "Is Jesus pretend? Why can't we see Jesus?" It's sort of a vortex going this week. And her mother answered her saying that even though we cannot see Jesus, Jesus is with us. Jesus is in our hearts, which is what I say in chapel. And her daughter answered her by saying, "Well, Jesus is not in my heart. Jesus is in my tummy." So, my work as preschool chaplain is the work that I offer as a priest. I offer my priestly work to adults and to children alike. And part of that is growing and releasing the gifts of awe and wonder that are central to our experience of connection to God, who, I will say up front, always and everywhere and today, God, yes, is indeed mystery. I estimate that the exchanges I had with the 4-year-olds are just, that the mother had, we all had, are just about the same thing in the exchanges in the Gospel of John that Jesus is having with the adults in local community, an exchange that he will also soon have with his own disciples. And these exchanges are about a rift and about union, ultimately about God and us living in our connection, one to each other and beyond that. So there is a difference between these exchanges, though. Jesus and each of the 4-year-olds have an honest tenderness about the rift. And the 4-year-olds were much freer in their curiosity about their connection to God. Now, the old hands that were practicing religious affairs in the Bible story have toughened, perhaps calloused to being immovable in caring, in ignorance, and their tenderness appears to be long past. And the rift is often characterized as such, tough and callous. It's expected. I mean, Garden of Eden, right? I recall the prophet's image of hearts of stone. But I think the mystical rift might actually be more of a tender place, where longing is a way to healing in mystical union. Too bad about those local folk. Too bad about the calluses being disconnected from the vulnerability that healing needs. They see only the nonsense in Jesus' reaching out to them. Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. My flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink." You can imagine, of course, by saying something like that, how he got them talking with this opening "I am" that is in the Gospel of John. "I am the bread of life. Eat my flesh and drink my blood, and abide in me, and I will abide in you." Abiding with God is John's language about healing the rift. John is the gospel of intimate abiding with God. Recall that John's gospel is also the gospel of living food and drink, which are everyday necessities and are the means of abiding with God. Abiding cannot get any more intimate than eating God's flesh and drinking God's blood. What an image, huh? So there's no less powerful, this is no less powerful because it is figurative, it is poetic. Indeed, figurative and poetic language is the metaphoric language of Jesus. There was a well-known rabbi by the name of Chaim Stern, and I believe I mentioned him before in a healing mass one Tuesday evening in the spring. Rabbi Stern was a writer and poet and the author, pretty remarkable, the author of the Reformed Judaism's current primary prayer books. It's like, take that prayer book in front of you, and he wrote that for Judaism, and more than one. He died in 2001, too young at 71. He was an inspiring religious light, crossing the boundaries of so many religious traditions. He emphasizes the power of ritual. Ritual, he writes, is poetry in action. How wonderful. What poetry does through words for us, ritual does through behavior for us. And never, never, never would it be, at least we're talking spiritual ritual done in some dogmatic way. That's a danger zone, right? That would be a fast track to the, how can this guy think he can give us flesh to eat and blood to drink crowd? Rather, ritual, as Rabbi Stern describes it, is an opening, a portal to broadening the perspective of one's soul. And like poetry, ritual identifies something that already abides, something that has perhaps gone on unnoticed. So that is theology that blissfully and wonderfully resonates, because we are born in grace by God, who is yet a creating God, right? The earliest documentation of Jesus' words about the Eucharist are about body and blood and taking and ingesting in remembrance of Him. His body for us and His cup as covenant. That's the earliest we have in 1 Corinthians. And following this first I am that is in our gospel today, there's so many more. I am vine, I am shepherd, I am door, I am this, I am that. Jesus says, I'm such and such. It goes on and on through the gospel. I am, I am, I am. And this is such reaching out to make mystical union. Today we hear, I am the bread of life. Eat my flesh and drink my blood. Abide in me and I abide in you. In this ritual of bread and wine, the medium is the message. Now, John is circular in his storytelling. We'll pick up the Gospel of Mark in a few weeks. Mark is very sort of linear, push forward. But I read a scholarly commentary on this rhythm in John that I very much like. John makes an early reference to something in his gospel, and then he picks it up again, and later reworks it, and then picks it up again and reworks it, and again and again and again, in a circle of stories and images. And what appear on the face of it at first reading to be sort of circles of repetition. I mean, some of that stuff can go on and on and on for pages, but they are not. The scholar said, think about this, that maybe these are spirals that grow, that take up that theme, and they grow in greater intensity in what is trying to teach and reinforce in the gospel's message. And that makes sense to me about John. For instance, how many times does Jesus talk about abiding? Abiding in Him, abiding in us, abiding in the Father. And so there's one paragraph that's like abiding is 20 times, I think. Abiding is picked up over and over as the gospel in a cycle of revisiting comes to finally abandonment at the cross by so many disciples. But of course, this abandonment is not the final word of the gospel, but it is resurrection and God's abiding presence and love. That's the climax of God's life for this world and in us and in that gospel story. And all this is all told, the Gospel of John, and the gospel stories of Jesus are all told in the power of poetic language, in ritual that makes space For however we come seeking, all of us, whoever we are, with questions that are remembered and questions that are not remembered, coming upon the things yet unnoticed even. Think about it. How does one talk about the love of the cross? What happened at the cross was history, but also what happened at the cross was more than history. What happened was love. And Jesus talked about the giving of himself and that love as a feast. This is my body. Take it, and in remembrance of me. Is there a better way than by talk of feasting, of consuming love, so that love may consume our living? Is Jesus made up? That guileless young boy asked. His question for next Wednesday's chapel is not so daunting after all, for he is asking it. His mystical vulnerability is still intact. I don't know his family's ritual, but we are certainly working on ritual at St. Mark's, right, in a ministry here, a place where ritual is precious and where our poetry as a community, as our prayer, and our deeds of love and action here and beyond will meet the poetry of God within that young soul. That is there. And the 4-year-old girl's questions came with her own answer, trying her own answer on for size, right? Is Jesus pretend? Why can't we see Jesus? Well, not in my heart, but in my tummy. Her mystical vulnerability is still intact, and her awareness is coming in a few different ways. Science tells us that our nervous systems are set up with a second brain that is in our stomachs. You know, when you feel, butterflies in your stomach, that's your brain kicking in there. And we have a neural system tied here and here, right? And the second brain in her, this 4-year-old, is allowed to think and to speak its piece. And of course, I love the Eucharistic resonance, that foodly resonance of Jesus abiding in her foodly center. And I guess, it's a tummy connection that might come from her Lutheran church-going, communion-eating ritual. Her questions were the same as the boys, but her questions made a guileless landing into her tummy, right? And in a humorous note, so was Jesus' poetic reaching, that our yearning might come in for a landing, guileless in our tummies. These 3, our Lord and these 2 dear children, also stand here in the Gospel of John, whose living bread and true drink of covenant love continues to abide in vulnerability. The grace that we have to offer in that mystic union continue. We abide in it, we abide for ourselves, we abide for others, we abide for God, abiding.